This PowerPoint is for Chapter 3 in Dennis Wixom and Tea Garden, and it's about requirements determination.
As I'm sure you're guessing by now, what I emphasize in the PowerPoints are what I find most important and want you to focus on. So I try to narrow down what can be a very long and arduous chapter into some golden nuggets. So the learning objectives I'd like to focus on for this chapter are for you to learn how to create a requirements definition. We will briefly discuss requirements analysis techniques. I want you to learn how to gather requirements. That's going to be emphasized in the hominid project. And then be able to create a system proposal. Now, a word to the wise. Satzinger's language can be different from Dennis's language. So in Satzinger, we talked about the inception phase. And here we are moving on to the elaboration phase. Although Dennis doesn't make a big deal about it, I want you to know that's where we are. And I'll show you that on the next slide.
I copied this slide from Satzinger Chapter 3, and we are still looking at the inception phase, and business modeling and requirements determination falls into the inception phase and the elaboration phase. As we move forward in the Dennis text to chapter 4, we will be much more into the elaboration phase. So, the lines are not extremely set in stone between what constitutes the inception phase or the elaboration phase. So that's really up to the project managers of a given project how they want to determine where these things exactly fall.
You'll see that some terms are used, or some different terms are used between Satzinger and Dennis. So I pulled this slide in from Satzinger chapter 3. And requirements definition includes, in Dennis's language, includes project scope and essential functionality. So that would fall into Satzinger's deliverables from the inception phase. So don't sweat the small stuff. Depending on which organization you work for, they're going to call these things different names. And so don't worry about what Satzinger calls it and what Dennis calls it. It's in the inception phase, and we are determining the high-level requirements for the system. I will take this opportunity to reiterate the importance of determining requirements. It is, I believe, and as do many others, the single most critical step of the entire development process. Changes can be made easily at this stage. Over 50% of system failures are due to problems with requirements, so we want to take our time and we want to get things nailed down as best we can. We will change or elaborate as we go on. It's an iterative process, but we want to get off to a good start. So determining requirements is a process. We can call it requirements determination process. We can call it defining the requirements. I'm not hung up on what an organization calls it. It is a process, though, and the purpose is to convert the high-level business requirements that we've already determined into detailed requirements that can be used for creating the detailed models that we're going to make, and which will then be used to undertake the system design. So we're in the analysis phase, what the old terms we would call the analysis phase. We are in the inception and moving into elaboration. So what's a requirement? A requirement is what the system must do, and they can fall into two types of requirements, functional and non-functional. Functional requirements relates to a business process or to data. Non-functional requirements relates to performance or usability specifications. So as you can see from this slide, Dennis calls requirements definition, where we list the functional and non-functional requirements. They can be prioritized, and it serves to scope the system. If you look back at the fourth slide, I think it's the 3.3 from Satzinger, some of what's on that slide could be called requirements definition. Here's another slide I grabbed from the Chapter 3 in Satzinger, and it's a list of the functional requirements for the RMO system that they describe within that chapter. And so I just want you to look at the key functions. It shows key functions of their RMO, proposed RMO system. These are functional requirements. They're functions of the system in terms of a user of the system. This slide depicts examples of non-functional requirements. So from an operational standpoint, the system that they're looking at here must fit in a pocket or a purse. Performance, any interaction between the user and the system shouldn't exceed 2 seconds. It talks about security, cultural and political aspects. Those are considered non-functional requirements of a system, but requirements nonetheless. So you might ask, how do we determine requirements for a system? Well, the best way to do that is to have systems analysts and business people get together and talk. And there are some strategies that we use for analyzing business requirements called business process analysis, process improvement, and process reengineering. Techniques for identifying these requirements, the most often used one is interviews. We can also develop questionnaires. We can observe people in their work environments. We can do a joint application design, and we also look at source documents. Many documents for an existing system are out of date and not much use because we are terrible at maintaining documentation typically, but we look at those anyway. A deliverable from the requirements determination process is called requirements definition. That's one name for it, and it includes the functional and non-functional requirements. We have gathered this information. We've gathered requirements. We have spoken with and interacted with users of the proposed and the as-is system, and we are careful through this analysis process not to let the scope creep. You know, it's a big danger. If we uncover something now that is essential that was missed in the inception, the vision plan or the inception plan that we created earlier, then we add it. Otherwise, we put it on the pile for the future enhancements. Dennis makes a big deal about differentiating between these requirements analysis strategies, and it's really the difference between these names is really one of degree. So business process automation, it has the least amount of change to the current system. Business process improvement has a moderate amount of change, and business process reengineering is, a lot of change, a complete makeover. So by looking at these different strategies, if we can categorize what our project is, if we can categorize it into one of these buckets here, then we know how much change and how much work is going to be involved in, generally speaking. we gather requirements. It's called requirements gathering. And there are different ways that we can do this. The goal is to uncover all of the requirements and to build support and trust with the users of the system. And the techniques to use are interviews, JAD sessions, questionnaires, document analysis, and observation. Interviews is the most popular technique for gathering requirements. You go to the people who are using the current system and the people who are going to be using the new system, and you talk to them. You find out what they do, how they do it, when they do it, etc. So you have to select the people that you're going to interview. You have to design the questions beforehand, at least some of them. You prepare for the interview by organizing your questions in a logical fashion, and then you conduct the interview and you follow up after the interview. So you will see how Dr. Andrea Tapia interviewed the key users of the hominid current system and the 2B system. You will see how she conducted those interviews, and she's very good at interviewing. So this will give you some good examples of, and you'll notice that when she's interviewing different people, she asks them different types of questions. When she's interviewing Joan, she's asking broader questions than when she's interviewing Matt or Chris later on. There are different types of questions that you can ask. So when we want specifics, we ask closed-ended questions. How many telephone orders do you receive a day? How many customer orders do you place, etc. Open-ended questions give us the opportunity, or give the user the opportunity to really expound. And so we aren't limited by what we ask and what we don't ask. We open the door for the user to talk. And if the user is verbal, this can be a really good way to find out information. If the user is not so verbal, you're going to have to ask probing questions like why, and can you give me examples, and could you elaborate on what you just said. You will see that Dr. Tapia asks different types of questions depending on who she's interviewing, as I mentioned before. So when she's interviewing Joan, they're more general, high-level questions. When she's interviewing a low-level people like Satama or Chris, and they're doing the markings on the ET DIPS system, those questions are very specific. And so you tailor the questions you ask to the level and of the actor or the users that you're speaking with. Once you've conducted an interview, it is good practice to write up your interview notes. Right? I always did this. And so there's just a structure that your project team will follow, and you will write your notes up in a text format and review those with the user. As you go to build the models using UML, you will look at your notes, and if you have audio files, you will listen to those too, but you will look at your notes and you will create the models from that information. You will note that you will have gaps. You take the model, you take your interview notes, you go back to the users, and you have a walkthrough. And we'll see that later as we build the models. Rather than conducting one-on-one interviews, which can take a long time, sometimes we get a bunch of users that do similar functions, and we put them in a room together, and we call it a joint application development or a JAD session. And it's facilitated probably by an analyst, and we conduct this JAD session where people are going back and forth and they're having a conversation. It's not unusual at all for a business process to span multiple business units, and so different areas in the organization deal with a given business process, and the left arm may not know what the right arm does. And from an analyst point of view, we can get contradicting information from different users. And one way to alleviate that, or to help iron that out as quickly as possible, is to get these people together and put them in a room and have them talk to one another. And that helps us, the analysts, figure out the overall process and who does what and how it gets done. If we want to gather information from a lot of people, one way to do that is through questionnaires, and these can be administered, obviously, electronically. We wouldn't do paper-based anymore. There are software programs to help, like SurveyMonkey, for instance, is one that I use frequently. This lets us get to large numbers of people, and we can have very structured questions with a Likert type scale from 1 to 7 response scale, or we can have open-ended questions, so we can get qualitative information as well as quantitative information. Developers are notoriously bad at keeping systems documentation up to date. And so any document analysis that you do, you must take into account that some of it, maybe a lot of it, is out of date and therefore incorrect. But with that said, another way we gather requirements is by looking at existing documents, documentation about a system. Another technique that we use to gather requirements is through observation. So we shadow the users, and people that we talk to won't remember all the details of what they do, and so for some really key processes, we will just sit with them and follow them around for a day or two. That really gives us a good idea of how they conduct their job and what we need to incorporate in the new system. As we saw in the chapters in Satzinger, we document what people want in the new system. And so we can call this a systems proposal. And it includes the request by the project sponsors for the system. It includes the work plan that has been developed by the project manager. It includes feasibility analysis, and it includes requirements definition. Then we move on to creating models. So as we move forward, we build out this system proposal. And you will see that as we move on to Chapter 4 in Dennis.